President Joe Biden is in a pretty precarious position when it comes to his favorability ratings across the country. And in fact, as we're going to go on in this video, Joe Biden is only above water in terms of approval rating in just 2 states, Hawaii and Vermont. And these 2 states happen to be some of the bluest states in the entire union. But even other historically Democratic states like New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Biden's home state, Maryland, California, and Washington all also have Joe Biden underwater. So we're going to talk about the implications of Joe Biden's disastrous approval ratings and how these are likely to impact the 2024 election and what it could mean for potential third-party candidates who may benefit from a defection of Joe Biden from the left flank of the Democrats going into the election. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So we've been talking about for a number of months how swing states have viewed Joe Biden very poorly, especially in the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And obviously you have other swing states as well, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, where Joe Biden's favorability is incredibly poor. But now we're getting into the territory where safe blue states, states that voted for Joe Biden by over 20 points, are now viewing him unfavorably. And that is certainly terrible for a Democratic president who already has a problem with his own base for not being progressive enough, not being pro-Palestine enough, which has certainly been hurting him with the youth vote all across the country, as we've seen on college campuses. But this is going to have reverberating impacts across not just swing states, but turnout in safe states as well. And if we take a look real quick, in California, Joe Biden is 6 points underwater. In Illinois, he is 11 points underwater. Washington State, he's 10. Oregon, he's 18. And I imagine a sizable chunk of that disapproval is coming from progressive voters, as we talked about earlier with the whole foreign policy issue and also domestic issues as well. You look at the state of New York, Joe Biden is underwater by 7 points. And we might talk about some polls out of New York later this week because the RCP average in New York is actually pretty bad for Joe Biden, and he's only above water by single digits, which in the state of New York is absolutely shocking. And we're going to talk about why that is in a future video. But Massachusetts, 8 points underwater. Connecticut, 8 points underwater. Island, 9 points underwater. The state of Maryland, 2 points underwater. And again, you know, Massachusetts, Maryland, you know, these are basically within the margin of error, so I don't even really count those. But, you know, Vermont, Joe Biden basically has an even approval rating. And in the state of Hawaii, that's the state that gives Joe Biden the best marks, plus 8% when it comes to approval rating. Now, I also imagine that polling in these states is a lot less frequent than states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, etc. But, you know, the fact that Joe Biden has such poor standing in heavily Democratic states is pretty concerning because that means there's a base turnout issue that likely could lead into 2024. If we take a look at the RCP average, Donald Trump is leading in the RCP average by about half a point. Now, for a Republican to win in the popular vote, that indicates the Democrat is in really bad shape. Now, you know, if we go back to 2020, Joe Biden was leading the RCP average at this point in time by about 8 points. Hillary Clinton was leading it by 1.5. So the fact that Donald Trump is leading the RCP average now, and he's been leading so consistently, obviously gives him a leg up for sure. And, you know, Joe Biden is in a much, much weaker position now than he was back in June of 2020. So he's essentially lost 8.5 points of ground since the last time he ran. And that's pretty concerning because, again, this election is going to come down to just a handful of swing states. And if you don't have enough Democratic support in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, the Rust Belt especially, you certainly have no chance in the election. Because if we talked about many of times in these videos, Joe Biden needs to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. You know, if Donald Trump wins Arizona and Georgia, which at this point it looks like he's going to, I mean, we could go back to the approval ratings. He's 27 points underwater in Georgia and 32 points underwater in Arizona. So at this point in time, you know, it looks like these 2 states actually are going to Donald Trump. Nevada, he's 31 points underwater. Absolutely abysmal numbers. I don't even think Donald Trump is doing that poorly in these states. So the fact that the incumbent president is viewed so poorly here probably indicates that you're going to have much higher Republican turnout relative to Democratic turnout. The real question is, how are independents going to vote? And if we take a look at the polls overall, independents view Joe Biden unfavorably by a margin of 69 to 21. So it's incredibly clear that Joe Biden really has no strong position with really any demographic. With African Americans, he's down considerably. Again, this is a group that typically votes for Democrats 90 to 10. And he only has a 64% approval rating among them, 23% disapproval rating. Again, a dip in African-American turnout, a dip in Latino turnout would be detrimental, especially in states like Pennsylvania, where you have a high African-American population in Philadelphia, a little bit in Pittsburgh, Latino population in places like Allentown, Northampton County. You know, so if you have dips with these groups, the election's already over. Now, Donald Trump just needs to improve marginally with the white working class and, of course, with middle-class whites. And if he's able to do that, he basically has the election, because all the numbers indicate that he's doing better with Hispanics, he's doing better with black voters, and he's even doing better with young voters, marginally speaking. So he really only needs to shore up his support among the white working class. That's what really lost him the 2020 election. There was a drop in his support among the white working class, and you could see that played out in Pennsylvania. Northeastern Pennsylvania had the largest shifts to the left in the entire state, and these are areas that are heavily white working class. So if Donald Trump can just improve with that demographic by just a couple of points, the election's basically a done deal. We go to the state of Michigan. You know, Joe Biden is underwater by 27 points. Disastrous. Wisconsin's one of the only states where Joe Biden is doing relatively well. And in fact, it's interesting to see that Wisconsin has a higher net approval of Joe Biden than a state like Oregon, for example, which is considerably bluer, or a state like Virginia, where Joe Biden is underwater by 18 points. And there's actually a poll that came out again in Virginia, and we talked about that in the last video, that essentially has the state as a dead heat according to the polls, which is incredibly alarming if you're a Democrat. Now, I've said in that video, I still think Democrats are going to win Virginia by several points, but I think it's more emblematic of the fact that Democrats are in a really poor position, even in states where they're supposed to be doing well. You know, looking ahead at Wisconsin, 11 points underwater. If we look at the RCP average there, Donald Trump is barely up in Wisconsin. So that actually correlates pretty well. You know, that's the swing state where by far Joe Biden has the best numbers and he's doing the best in the polling. Michigan's the state where he has really poor numbers, and of course Michigan's RCP average has him at about 0.5. Pennsylvania has Donald Trump up by 2.3. North Carolina 4.8. North Carolina is, you know, almost gone at this point. 22 points underwater for Joe Biden. Georgia 27, as we said before. Arizona looks to be the worst. In fact, out of all the swing states that we always talk about, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, which North Carolina I almost put out of that category at this point because it seems very likely that Donald Trump is going to win it. But if you look at the 6 states that really are going to decide the election, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Trump's numbers, or Joe Biden's numbers, I should say, are the worst in Arizona. And in the RCP average, Donald Trump is up by 4. The state where Joe Biden's doing the worst is Nevada, which typically oversamples Republican support. So, you know, you could say maybe Trump's above water by 2 or 3 points in the polls there. But, you know, the moral of the story is that Joe Biden is doing terrible everywhere. Now, we just had the indictment, or the conviction, I should say, of Donald Trump in Manhattan with that hush money case or whatever. The polls haven't shifted since then. Now, obviously, you have to give it a couple weeks because this just happened. But I'm suspecting at this point in time it's not going to have a massive impact because most voters, I believe, already have their opinions of Donald Trump regardless of this case. You know, the people that thought Donald Trump was guilty in this case aren't really voting for him anyway. And even the ones that do think he's guilty but are voting for him anyway, I don't really think a conviction is really going to change all of that. So obviously, we're going to have to wait and see. I was very wrong back in the midterms when I said abortion wasn't going to be the #1 issue. It basically was the #1 issue. So obviously, a couple weeks' time, we'll have a better answer on that. But as of right now, you know, Joe Biden really doesn't have anything going for him. The economy is still very sluggish. Gas prices are still high. The situation in the Middle East is just as bad as it ever was. And there really is no sense that America has a steady hand of leadership. And when an incumbent president is on the ballot, that's one of the things voters are looking for. And the approval ratings nationwide back up the fact that Americans do not think Joe Biden's leadership is sufficient enough. Now, again, there's going to be a contingent of these disapproval, these people that don't like Joe Biden that are going to vote for him anyway. Obviously, there's still plenty of Democrats that disapprove of Joe Biden. In fact, we can look at the numbers right now. 15% of Democrats disapprove of Joe Biden. I guarantee you 97% of Dems are probably going to vote for Joe Biden in November, obviously. But overall, you know, a dip in turnout in any of these states. Again, if we look at the margin of the vote in the key states here, Pennsylvania, for example, Joe Biden only winning here by around 80,000 votes. Again, this is a state with over 12 million people, a state with about 7 million votes. and only 80,000 votes separated Donald Trump and Joe Biden. That very, very likely could swing the other way in Donald Trump's direction. We take a look at Wisconsin, where the margin of the vote here is around 20,000 votes. Obviously, in Georgia, it was only 12,000 votes. In Arizona, it was around 11,000 votes. So, you know, we're looking at just a tiny handful of votes here and there in these key swing states that really make the difference. And I suspect they're going to be incredibly close again in 2024, if not potentially Donald Trump having an advantage. Now, you know, bad approval ratings among African Americans relative to other Democrats is obviously very good for Donald Trump, because again, as we looked, Biden's numbers with African Americans are pretty poor, especially in the Atlanta metro area, which has been zooming towards the left. Again, if you can drop black turnout here as a Republican, you're probably going to win the state of Georgia. And one of the reasons why Joe Biden was able to win the state of Georgia was because the non-white vote there, I think, was around 30%, which I think is like the benchmark of what you need in order to win the state overall. So, you know, very, very bad numbers for Joe Biden overall. And the fact that Joe Biden is only above water in 2 states in the entire country in June of an election year is very concerning. Now, we still have the conventions, obviously. There's still months and months to go, and we're going to be covering this, obviously, throughout all the way till November. But, you know, you definitely don't want to be Joe Biden, I think, at this point in time, because Democrats do have fundamental advantages in the Rust Belt, but when you have approval ratings, you know, 26 points underwater, 27 points underwater, in states that you barely won the last time around, you're definitely in a very poor position. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.